unmute. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Lynn, for this introduction. It's a pleasure for me to discuss my book in my neighborhood library, and it's an honor. So welcome also everybody online. Let me share the presentation because I have also some interesting pictures and graphs for you. So I'll start actually with a little anecdote about how my colleague from Tufts University and my co-author Oxana Shevel and I decided to write this book and what led us to it. Did I mess something up with the, oh, there, it disappeared. If you remember, in the beginning of 2022, there was really frantic diplomacy going on as it was becoming clearer and clearer that Russia is preparing a massive invasion of Ukraine. And there was a lot of debate then in foreign policy circles about what to do about this. Was it likely? Was it really just positioning and a bluff by Russia? What was going to happen? And at that point, one of the loud voices and a lot of the discussion on this was influenced by the argument that really this is just geopolitical wrangling between Russia and the West, Russia feeling pressured by the West through NATO expansion and preparing to maybe respond to this by invading Ukraine. And at that moment, Oksana and I, who've both worked on both Russia and Ukraine for the last 20 years or so, saw that there was a lot of misrepresentation of facts and also very little attention to actually the domestic politics of both Russia and Ukraine, the domestic drivers of this process. And we wanted to push back against this. And we started by writing these shorter pieces in places like Foreign Affairs and eventually the publisher came to us and said, well, why don't you write a whole book about this? By that time, the full-scale invasion had already started, and a lot of the surprises kept piling on, because if you remember, again, in the very beginning of the full-scale invasion in February of 2022, everybody expected that Ukraine is not going to be able to hold on. It will be run over by Russia very quickly. In fact, a lot of people were even saying that Ukrainians are not really going to fight, that they're going to be okay with this invasion because they have a corrupt government. At that time, we wrote these short pieces saying, no, do not count on this. Ukrainians will resist. We know Ukrainian domestic politics. The resistance will be significant, and it is quite possible that Ukraine is going to withstand this aggression. So it turned out that we were right about a lot of these short-term predictions at that time. So we went back and we thought, how can we explain this puzzle? Why did Russia launch this invasion, and why did Ukraine resist so strongly? And what we arrived at when we started pulling our expertise together, we arrived at an argument that really focuses on the divergence between the two states in the last 30 years. And it really starts with the way in which the Soviet Union collapsed. If you remember, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed in a peaceful decision by the then leaders of the three constituent republics: Russia, represented by Yeltsin, Ukraine, represented by its recently elected President Kravchuk, and Belarus, represented by the Speaker of Parliament, Shushkevich. You see the three men there. They signed on December 8th, 91, they signed the so-called Belovezha Accords, where they declared independence from the Soviet Union for their three respective countries. At the time, Ukrainian President Kravchuk called this a civilized divorce. And it was a very fitting metaphor in the beginning. But when we think about how the two countries started evolving as independent states recognized by international law at that point, we go back and we realize that a more fitting metaphor for on the side of Russia, on the side of the Russian government, was that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a rewriting of the wedding vows. They did not, in fact, plan to have a divorce with all of these states. The idea in Russia was that the Soviet Union, as the basis for holding these territories together, was a spent force. It, at that point, was crumbling. Communism had not delivered on its promise. The communist regime was crumbling. Yeltsin was very much an anti-communist and wanted to destroy the communist state, the Soviet Union. But the idea was that once this particular marriage was dissolved, they would rewrite the wedding vows in a different way. But the countries will continue to be bound together in some form of political, economic, and cultural union. So we see from the very start a difference between how Russia and Russian elites perceive the dissolution of the Soviet Union and how Ukrainians perceive the dissolution of the Soviet Union. What you see on the map there is Ukrainians voting in a referendum on independence in 1991, and you see that they overwhelmingly voted for independence from the Soviet Union in all the regions of the country, including in Crimea, a majority, a smaller majority, but still a majority voted for independence from the Soviet Union. So what we argue in the book is that this sort of different understanding in Russia versus Ukraine of what it meant for the Soviet collapse, for their independent states, this different understanding launches what we call an escalatory cycle. It's an escalatory cycle between Ukraine's commitment to its own newly found independence and Russia's commitment to re-imperialize the area, to find ways in which it can tie Ukraine and other former Soviet states back to itself through some process. And it's an escalatory cycle because both processes feed each other. The more Ukraine commits to its independence, the more Russia looks for ways to actually bring Ukraine back. And the more Russia pressures Ukraine to bring it back, the more Ukraine actually commits strongly to its independence and to defending it. So this escalatory cycle led over time to very divergent trajectories between the two states. Basically, the big story here that characterizes the last 30 years is that Ukraine gradually builds a democratic regime based on political pluralism and competition, while Russia gradually slides back into authoritarianism. This is sort of a tongue-in-cheek way to illustrate this, but it is quite telling. It shows that from 2000 to this day, Russia has had the same leader. You see Putin peeking behind Medvedev's shoulder in between 2008 and 2012. This was basically a constitutionally determined sort of swap in positions where Putin became the prime minister and Medvedev became the president. But really, when Medvedev's term was up, he did not even try to run for re-election. He immediately gave his position back to Putin. So it is reasonable to say that Putin has been effectively in power for all of these 24 years. And in Ukraine, on the other hand, we have no president who has ever won re-election. Every incumbent has lost their attempt to be re-elected. The only president who did win re-election was Kuchma once. He was elected in 96. He won re-election in 2000. He was allowed only 2 terms. He stepped down. He did not run in conforming to the constitutional requirements. Now, Ukraine's democratization really was a gradual process that was punctuated by major mobilizations by civil society aimed at pushing democratization further. And the 2 mobilizations that you're probably familiar with are the Orange Revolution in December 2004 and the Euromaidan revolution, known in Ukraine as the Revolution of Dignity, in December to February of 2014. These are 2 pictures that I took in both of these revolutions from more or less the same vantage point. You see the same Ukraine hotel in the background, the Ukrainian flags. I was doing research on Ukraine starting in about 2002, so I did go to both of these revolutions to observe firsthand. Now, they're both significant to Ukrainian democratization for 2 reasons. The first revolution was about stolen elections. As I mentioned, Kuchma in 2004 was already not allowed to run for a 3rd term. He complied with the constitution and he did not run for a 3rd term. However, he had chosen a successor, the incumbent prime minister, Viktor Yanukovych, and the state, with state resources, supported the Yanukovych campaign in very significant ways. The opponent in that race was Viktor Yushchenko, who was a leader of the opposition, of a big opposition party at that time, a former governor of the central bank, a very popular politician who was pushing for more democratization, for a European path for Ukraine, whereas Yanukovych was representing sort of the more pro-Russian path, and on top of it, the oligarchic influence over politics. Now, the election was very, very close. However, exit polls showed that Yushchenko was narrowly winning the election. But when the results came out, it showed that Yanukovych had narrowly won the election of the 2nd round, the presidential election runoff. That triggered massive protests and a court challenge by the Yushchenko campaign about electoral irregularities. As the court was going through the evidence of electoral irregularities, there were tens of thousands, at some point hundreds of thousands of people on the streets pushing for a rerun of the election, but a clean one. Eventually, the Orange Revolution succeeded. It succeeded for several reasons. It succeeded because there was massive civil society turnout in support of free elections, hundreds of thousands of people. The court process worked. In fact, the court did find the evidence of irregularities and threw out the decision of the Central Election Commission and ordered a rerun of the second round. And also, the elites themselves, the Yushchenko campaign and the Yanukovych campaign, in fact, came together, brokered in negotiations by the outgoing President Kuchma, participating with European and also Russian representatives, and they hammered out a compromise solution. The compromise solution was that the elections will be indeed rerun, but the presidency as an institution will be weakened through constitutional reforms, and Ukraine would become a parliamentary democracy as opposed to a presidential system. So what that implied was that if Yushchenko won the rerun, as he was expected to do, given that that's what the polls were showing, he would in fact ascend to a slightly weaker presidency. And Yanukovych, through his leadership of a party in parliament, would have significant sway in politics. So this was a major democratizing moment for Ukraine because, first of all, it demonstrated that elections will not be stolen and manipulated, that people will in fact support clean elections. It showed that elites are willing to compromise. It showed that the rule of law matters because the courts heard evidence and took decision accordingly. And indeed, after 2005, we see in Ukraine a significant consolidation of some of these principles, that elections will not be stolen. What was missing in the post-2005 period was really a breakthrough in terms of controlling corruption. This is something that Yushchenko had promised, but there was a lot of fragmentation in the period in which he governed. He did not deliver on this promise. Eventually, Yanukovych was elected to the presidency in a free and fair election. But once he was elected to the presidency, he started a campaign aimed at rolling back some of the democratic gains of the previous period. He controlled the courts. He was basically trying to establish within parliament a stronger and bigger faction for his party through blackmail and through buying of individual MPs. So in his years in power, his authoritarian sort of democratic backsliding was not something at the time that was a very popular phenomenon globally, but certainly Yanukovych was one of the pioneers of democratic backsliding. So why do we get the second major revolution in Ukrainian political development? We get it because Yanukovych had, the Ukrainian government had been negotiating an agreement with the EU on an association agreement, which meant preferential trade with Europe. And at the very last moment, Yanukovych unilaterally pulled out of that agreement. So, and when I say the very last moment, literally, a couple of days before the agreement was supposed to be officially signed, he announced that Ukraine will not be signing it and pulled out. That triggered a massive protest. That's why it's called Euromaidan, because they wanted to have this association agreement with the EU signed. However, that's not the main reason the protest escalated. In addition to the demands so they protested for a couple of weeks. It was mostly young people and students, and then the regime, the Yanukovych government, cracked down with significant violence. Basically, the students were beaten up in the middle of the night as they were camping in the square. And that actually, as you know how it usually works in democracies, once the government oversteps, that in fact expands the protest. Suddenly, there were a lot more people who were on the streets, not simply because of the EU agreement, but because they wanted to protest what they saw as a government that was becoming more and more repressive and was moving in a direction that Russia had already arrived at long before. So that's what really expanded the size of the protests. Protesting against the brutality with which the initial protest was suppressed. Not only were people beaten in the square, but hundreds were arrested, charged criminally with resisting arrest. So the protest focused on rule of law issues. The protest also focused on corruption issues. It basically brought out all of these grievances against the Yanukovych regime that were really building up during his time in power. How does the Euromaidan protest end? It ends with major escalation. It ends with the Yanukovych government trying to suppress the protest by shooting people in the streets. Over 100 people were shot dead by police. And however, after the shooting of people in Maidan, basically that also did not make the crowds leave. What it resulted in was the crumbling of the Yanukovych coalition. Basically, his own ministers abandoned him, his party fell apart, people started fleeing, he saw the writing on the wall, and he fled the country himself. Once he fled the country, once you don't have a sitting president in the country anymore, Parliament had an extraordinary session to think about how to deal with this. And what they came up with is that they're going to have a vote, a parliamentary vote, basically putting to a vote the notion that the president has removed himself from office by leaving the country. A majority of parliamentarians voted for this, including members of his own party who crossed the floor and voted for this resolution. So they called for this resolution resulted in the Speaker of Parliament becoming the temporary president and calling new elections in a few months' time to replace in a democratic election. So this was the closest that you can get to a fully constitutional and democratic process for dealing with such an extraordinary situation. But as we know, what happened next is something that they did not count on. Right after this vote, around these votes, Russia is already launching an operation undercover, green men, the so-called little green men, who take over Crimea very quickly through a coup in Crimea, and then Russia starts funneling resources to try to jumpstart more unrest within Ukraine. So Russia's invasion really starts at the end of Euromaidan. Now, what is Russia's reaction to the Ukrainian revolutions? In both cases, Russia's reaction is twofold. First, to tighten the screws at home, to establish an even more authoritarian regime at home, and so the divergence becomes even bigger between the two countries, and to figure out ways to commit more strongly to ways in which it could get Ukraine back somehow. So after the Orange Revolution, for example, the Russian government reacts with paranoia about the possibility of such an event in Russia itself. At that time, Putin is finishing up his first term. He wants to be reelected to a second term. So it really triggers this massive demand in Ukraine for clean elections, triggers massive paranoia in Russia. It results in civil society groups being harassed, all sorts of laws being passed to suppress political opposition. Literally, Putin cancels gubernatorial elections within Russia's regions in the same month in which the Orange Revolution is taking place in Ukraine. Suddenly he says all these governors of Russia's dozens of regions are no longer going to be elected offices. I'm now going to appoint the governors. So this is taken immediately in the wake of the Orange Revolution. One of the oligarchs who had some sort of opposition leanings, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, was quickly put on trial, convicted. We have in 2006 famous Russian journalist who was documenting Russia's excesses in Chechnya, Anna Politkovskaya, murdered on Putin's birthday as a present to him. So we see tightening in Russia of the authoritarian regime in the wake of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. We see also a growing commitment by the Putin regime to the so-called Russian World project. This is a project that basically identifies all states that have Russian speakers in them as part of the Russian world, and therefore as targets to be reincorporated in a Russian, it's more than a sphere of influence, it's called Russian world, in Russia's, basically under Russia's control. After Euromaidan, the reaction, of course, is the annexation of Crimea, and then the opening of a front in eastern Ukraine through an undercover process. And we see, though, in Russia after 2014, the so-called Krym Nash effect, which means Crimea is ours effect. It's not only did Putin grab Crimea in violation of international law, but it turns out that this is a wildly popular decision with Russian society. You see here on this picture in the bottom demonstrations, celebrations of Russia taking Crimea in 2014. So that's the escalatory cycle that we talk about, that the more Ukraine commits to its independence, the more Russia commits to figuring out a way to take Ukraine back, to bind it back to itself and to forcefully incorporate it into the Russian world. So one illustration that I wanted to give you, and this is what we go over in the book in a couple of chapters. One illustration of the gradual distancing between the two countries has to do with this idea that Ukrainians increasingly commit to their Ukrainian identity. There are many ways in which this is demonstrated through commitments to the Ukrainian language, to commitments to studying Ukrainian history, but I wanted to show you here one illustration, which is a simple one. It's a question that's been asked since 1991 in Ukraine, and the question is, what do you consider yourself? Who are you? And this kind of question, it's a very common question in surveys done around the world. Usually you're given a whole bunch of different identities as options because, for example, here we can identify as a Montrealer, as a Quebecer, as a Canadian, as a North American maybe, or as the ethnicity of our parents, etc. There are different ways in which every person can identify themselves. So, so what I'm tracking here, what we're showing here, is the number of people who chose as their first identity citizen of Ukraine, a Ukrainian citizen. It doesn't matter, it's not about Ukrainian ethnically, but a citizen of the state, of the independent state of Ukraine. And you see that in the 2000s, this is a leading identity, as in other countries. A lot of people identify with their nationality by passport, but it's about 40%. After 2005, this increases. After the Orange Revolution, it increases to about 50%. It stays about that for most of the 2000s, and then you see a really big jump. And you see that the jump is between 2013 and 2014. The jump happens literally in the 2 months of Euromaidan. Why does it happen? Because once Russia has attacked Ukraine, suddenly more people identify within Ukraine with Ukraine because they've been attacked. And it, in the 8 years between 2014 and 2022, it's a similar kind of percentage. And once the full-scale invasion is launched in February of 22, you see another big jump from 65 to 85%. So what this illustrates is that Russia's continued pressure, and which eventually escalated into aggression against Ukraine, has only served to really solidify Ukrainians' commitment to their independent statehood. And then I want to show you some graphs that are going to address the idea that this is simply a geopolitical issue, that it has all to do with Ukraine wanting to join NATO and the EU, and that's what caused it. And if the West had not interfered, had not given Ukraine any promises, because of course they never, to this day, they're still not accepting Ukraine, right? But if they had not given the promises, maybe things would have been avoided. Now, what this illustrates to you is that Ukraine does make eventually a geopolitical choice, but it makes this choice after it has already been attacked. So this choice cannot be the reason for the attack on Ukraine because it happens really after the first attack. You see that throughout the 2000s, there is a majority of Ukrainians who are against NATO membership. In 2010, 11, 12, it's 64%, around 60% are against NATO membership, and only about 20% want NATO membership. The two lines completely switch when? Exactly when Ukraine is attacked by Russia. That's why it needs the protection of NATO membership, because it's now attacked. Even when it's attacked first by Russia in 2014, that leads to this switch. So now majorities, more people want in NATO than are against NATO, but still it's not a clear majority because people still think in Ukraine, well, maybe we'll find some way in which we can be neither in NATO nor with Russia, some middle way. A big percentage of Ukrainians are committed to this position. It's Russia that rejects this position and invades in 2022. So in 2022, after the invasion, suddenly you have 86% of Ukrainians wanting NATO membership and only about 5, 6, 7, 8% not wanting it. The same thing with belonging to the EU. The choice is made, but the choice is not the cause of the invasion. It's the result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And I want to illustrate this with one more graph. It shows a really interesting question that Ukrainians, again, have been asked for 30 years already. And the question is, what should be the relationship between Ukraine and Russia? And they're given 3 options. The relationship should be the same as with other foreign states. So nothing special. We're just 2 foreign states that happen to be neighbors, but two different states. There is another option that says, well, we're both independent states, but we're friendly. We have some special relationship due to the common past, to the intertwined past. So an independent but friendly relationship. And then there's the option that in fact Russia is now pursuing. We should be in the same state. And you can see that when in the earlier period, there is a percentage, a significant percentage of Ukrainians who think, well, maybe one state is okay. That drops off very quickly. But what you see is for the entire period, until 2014, the majority of Ukrainians, the top graph with the 73% at the top, this is independent states but friendly. The majority of Ukrainians wanted this. It is the two Russian invasions that turned them against this idea. It drops off significantly in 2014 when they're first attacked. A significant percentage understand that this is probably not going to be possible to be independent but friendly states. So it should be just two separate states, nothing special. And of course, after February of 22, that increases the number that don't want a special relationship with Russia is now a huge majority. And Zelensky really expressed this quite cogently when Russia was bombing the civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. He directed himself to Russians and to the Russian state directly and said, read my lips. Do we want to be without gas or without you? We choose without you. Do you want to be without light or without you? We choose without you. Without water or without you? Without you. And in the end, he ends, cold, starvation, darkness, and thirst are not as frightening and mortal to us as your friendship and fraternity. So this is where the divergence between the two states is at this point. And this is a rupture that is unlikely to be repaired anytime soon. Ukrainians have diverged now to the point that they want nothing to do with Russia. And I'll end here.
Thank you very much. That's sobering. Any questions? Please put up. Okay, I'm coming with the mic.
It's a language. A lot of Ukrainian were speaking Russian or Ukrainian. Even the armed forces, they speak Russian. Has that changed?
So there is a bit of a change. There is some change, but the language issue is really complicated. But here's how I'll try to explain this. When I emphasize that Ukrainians committed to independent Ukraine, that just means the state of Ukraine. A lot of them continue to speak Russian. They fight the Russians in Russian. It is not an ethnic conflict in any way imaginable. What language you speak is a result of the Russian Empire being in control of these territories for centuries, right? That's why they speak Russian, a lot of them. More people are committing, indeed, to speaking Ukrainian as a political decision. But there's still an enormous number of people who speak Russian on a daily basis. If you go to Kyiv right now, you'll see people speaking Russian in the streets, predominantly even. So it's a dynamic situation, but they are speaking Russian. What they do not want is to be Russian and to be in Russia. So it's now language. It's not a simple, Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers. The Russian speakers are fighting the Russian invasion at the exact same rates as the Ukrainian speakers.
Thank you.
Other questions, and a reminder to the Zoom audience that were watching for typed questions. Oh, there's one in the Zoom now that I'll read. As a Ukrainian, I'd like to add and emphasize that a lot of Ukrainians are speaking Russian because Russia has been Russifying, is that the pronunciation?
Yeah.
The territories they've invaded for centuries.
Absolutely. It's basically the imperial language that's still there, and it's not going to be abandoned overnight, of course. So that's what it's the result of, yeah.
Yes, I'm coming to the man in the back with the mic.
Thank you. I was just wondering why Hungary doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, and what's the politics of Hungary in all this?
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems there seems to be two related reasons for the Hungarian position. The first one is that the Hungarian Prime Minister is a bit of a dictator. He has consolidated a tight grip on power in Hungary, and economically, he wants to play a spoiler role within Europe, and so siding with Russia is a good way to play the spoiler role. What he gets from playing the spoiler role is he gets to blackmail the EU for the various decisions, to blackmail also NATO. Hungary was the last one to approve Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO. And so this is a way to have leverage. And it doesn't flow from a Hungarian position, it flows from the position of the Hungarian government. Now, the second reason that some people suspect may have something to do with it is that there is a historically Hungarian part of Ukraine in Western Ukraine. It's a very small part, but there's a Hungarian minority in Western Ukraine. There are some analysts who argue that the reason Hungary is, or Orban is playing this double game is because if Russia gets overrun by Russia, I mean, if Ukraine gets overrun by Russia and dismembered, Hungary is going to potentially get some territories in that dismemberment. Now, I think it's, obviously this is not on the agenda, it's not happening anytime soon, but there are some analysts who are arguing that that's part of the motivation. I think the corruption, blackmail motivation is stronger.
Other questions? Okay, Maria, you have to speak into the mic. No, for the Zoom audience.
Sorry. Yes, I would like to go back to the invasion of Crimea during 2014. I have heard the Russians saying at the time that they were, like you said, very excited, very happy that this happened. Yeah. And they said that the reason was because Crimea was originally belonged to Russia, and so it was given to Ukraine because it was part of the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet Union was broken, so it was in the right of the Russians to get back their own Crimea. Is that true or not? Or was it just some publicity of the regime at the time?
So it's a little, there is some truth to that, but there's also a significant complication. Crimea is not historically Russian. If anything, Crimea, I mean, was part of the Ottoman Empire, right? And the indigenous population of Crimea are the Crimean Tatars. And the Crimean Tatars are, in fact, the people who protested the strongest and continue to protest and would like to be part of Ukraine rather than part of Russia. So the argument that, you know, Crimea is Russian is immediately complicated by the fact that it's Crimean in the first place, and the indigenous people of Crimea want to be in Ukraine rather than in Russia. The second argument about whether Crimea was traditionally, it was sort of given to Ukraine. The thing is that the Soviet Union drew arbitrary borders all the time. if we're going to revisit those borders and say, well, Crimea had more ethnic Russians living there, so it's okay to return it to Russia, then it opens up a really huge can of worms. There's a huge part of Russia itself that was taken by the Soviet regime from Ukraine and given to Russia. Should they do this swap? Should they now, and that, by the way, is a much bigger territory, the Kuban. So should suddenly Russia give that territory to Ukraine? Because that was also arbitrarily given to Russia, right? So it's not a place to start. But also the third point is that, and that's where the biggest misinformation, I think, has made a lot of inroads, is that the Crimean population, however we arrived at that outcome, that the Crimean population wanted to break from Ukraine and to join Russia. Russia is making this argument using the referendum results that they ran very quickly. However, there is no evidence that these results are at all representative of popular opinion in Crimea itself. In the period in which Crimea was part of Ukraine, there was a party in Crimea dedicated to breaking with Ukraine and joining Russia. That party got about 4% of the vote in every election. So the percentage of people who actually wanted to break off from Ukraine and join Russia was way smaller than what Russian misinformation presents this as a majority.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Anything in the chat? Would you like to comment on Vladimir Zelensky's role as the leader?
He's a really interesting figure because when he ran in 2019, he ran on a promise that sounds a little Trumpian in today's context. He basically said, well, I'm going to talk to Putin and I'm going to fix the problem in the East and we're going to find a solution. And so this simmering war that had been there for 8 years is going to be solved. Now, he got elected on this promise to fix things, not as a pro-Russian candidate. He was challenged by some pro-Russian candidates that got a small percentage of the vote. But he had this optimistic view. And he had only one meeting with Putin, in which Putin really tried to humiliate him, and it became very clear to him very quickly that it was not possible to, in fact, talk to Putin and come up with a solution that is even minimally realistically acceptable to the Ukrainian electorate. So the time, though, that he really stepped up, because in the 3 years that he was president before the full-scale invasion, there was a significant proportion of the Ukrainian electorate who were very skeptical about his commitment to fight for Ukraine. They thought that he might be willing to sell out Ukraine to Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And so in 22, when he made this stand and said, I'm not going anywhere, I need ammunition and not a right, he really rose up to the occasion. And it earned him enormous trust and respect within Ukraine and outside, as we know. Now, that being said, I think it's important to also keep in mind that he will not be a leader. He might indeed follow Churchill's political trajectory. If the war is over and there's an election, he's probably likely to lose it. At this point, people do respect his handling of the war, but he is not seen as sort of the solution to all of Ukraine's problems. There's a lot of criticism domestically within Ukraine on his policies on different things. So I think one thing that's important is for us not to be sort of worried that he will become some sort of mirror image of Putin, super powerful within Ukraine, everybody loves him and adores him. It's far from that. There's a lot of criticism of him within Ukraine.
Questions, comments?
Oh, there's a...
We have two questions
Oh,
in the chat.
okay. I have to swivel around to read.
Yeah, this one.
So Annie, based on everything you know up to today, where would your idealistic hopes lie for a return to peace? And more informative, where would skeptical might some of your cynical guesses?
Where would your skeptical...
Oh, I'm muted. I apologize.
Okay, so,
you've got the question. Thank you.
I got the question. My hope for the end of the war is that eventually the Russian war machine would simply not be able to keep up. They've already fought, they've lost at this point 600,000. They have 600,000 casualties on the Russian side. This is not only killed, but also incapacitated, people who cannot return to the battlefield. These are enormous, enormous losses.
And on the Ukrainian side?
Fewer, but also significant, of course, but fewer. And the reason they're fewer is that Russia relies on these meat assaults that they call them, where it's basically throwing people in waves at small targets. So the best case scenario is the Russian economy cannot keep up and the Russian war machine, simply the logistics starts disintegrating. If we get to this point, Putin will withdraw and will call it a victory. He will say that they fought against NATO bravely, that they inflicted a lot of damage, that they destroyed half the country, and they have destroyed the Nazi towns. I mean, he will come up with a spin, and he will justify this to the Russian people, and they will accept it. But this is an idealistic hope. We're not at that point, and it's very hard to know how long Russia can keep this up. Unfortunately, we're facing now a situation in which Ukraine is also taken a lot of losses. It cannot keep this up also forever. The West's help has been significant, but very measured and very moderate and very slowly given. So it is not clear also that Ukraine can keep this up. But the really important thing is that if there is to be a stable solution to this, an actual peace, there has to be some way in which independent Ukraine, in whatever territory it is incorporated into NATO and the Western institutions, because that's the only way in which you can send a message to Russia that a third invasion will not work because the NATO deterrence will be in place. Without this, it will be another invasion.
What would it cost to join NATO?
You'll have to repeat the question, please.
What it would cost?
Like, wouldn't that be expensive too to join NATO?
That's not necessarily a cost associated with it. Right now, the Ukrainian army is
build up reserves and equipment and also. I mean, I'm just asking. Right?
Yeah, no, but it really is not. The reluctance does not come from resources, okay, because the resources are not the issue here. The West has enormous stockpiles that they're sitting in warehouses that are not being used. So
Ukraine would still have to pay for that, though.
Sure, but that's not really what's at stake and what is making NATO reluctant. The reluctance comes not from the resources, but from the fear that Russia will still want to challenge NATO. That if Ukraine is in NATO, Russia will still attack Ukraine and take the risk of fighting all of NATO because they want Ukraine so badly. That's one of the considerations. And then the second consideration is the West has already demonstrated that we will not fight for Ukraine, that we will not send our soldiers to die in Ukraine. And so if we accept Ukraine in NATO and Russia attacks and we don't defend Ukraine with our soldiers, NATO is dead, and then Russia can attack other countries. That's the fear. That's the fear. But it's a battle of wills right here. What we know is that Russia has not attacked the Baltics, even though they're tiny, because they're in NATO. So Russia believes that NATO works. That's the argument for including Ukraine in NATO now. That now when Russia is tired from this war, doesn't have the resources to maintain it, doesn't have the resources to widen the front, that it's going to be one way or another, it's a gamble. But the problem is that both of the options have significant risks. Because if we signal, on the one hand, if we don't accept Ukraine in NATO, then we don't have to fight for it. On the other hand, if we don't accept Ukraine in NATO, when it is in our interest to do so, we're sending a signal to Russia that we're really afraid of fighting it. We're really afraid of fighting it. And so if we keep sending this signal, Russia will probe by attacking someone else. And the risk that we're taking is that Russia will probe in a place where it's going to look easy. Either the Baltics, but it also, for us Canadians, we have to consider that it could be the Arctic. Because the same arguments that people are making now, well, should we have World War III over Ukraine? Well, imagine those arguments. Should we have World War III over the Arctic? Nobody lives there. Why not just let Russia take the Arctic because we don't want World War III? So either way, we are in a risky moment. That's the point I want to make here. That there's no silver bullet solution here. We're in a very risky moment because Russia is committed to this expansion.